first portion of this session will involve an interactive poll. So if everyone could just take a moment to, while they're eating, just open up the conference app. I'll give you a minute to do that and we'll get started. So we have an interesting set of questions that we've designed for everyone here, and would appreciate your vote on the next 4 questions that will pop up on the screen. All right. So this first question, do you believe the Trump-Kim summit has set the United States on a path to a breakthrough in relations with North Korea? A, yes. 1, yes. 2, no. And I will momentarily activate voting. Oh, 1 second, I will help you. So what you do is you open up the conference app and then go to the schedule section. And then under the schedule, there should be under the 12 p.m. tab, the North Korea diplomacy breakout session. And then you click on that and scroll to the bottom, and you should be able to see the poll. If you don't, feel free to just raise your hand. We have people who will circulate and help you out with that. All right, so we have a number of votes coming in now. In just a minute or so, I'll disable the voting. All right. So if you could get your final votes in. Okay, so interesting results. It seems like everyone here is pretty evenly split on what will happen in the next weeks and months to come. Okay, so we'll move on to the second question. If tensions with North Korea recede, how many troops should the United States retain in South Korea? 1, all. 2, most. 3, some. Or 4, none. And I'll activate voting. Okay, I'll give everyone just a few more seconds here to get in their votes. All right, so it looks like there's a little bit more consensus here on U.S. troop presence, and many of you voted all or most.
And then you'll want to.
All right, the third penultimate question. Would China support trilateral efforts among the U.S., DPRK, ROK to reach a peace agreement ending the Korean War? So bringing another great power into the equation here. And again, I'll allow voting. All right, interesting results here. So it looks like we're all pretty divided here as well. So it should be an interesting discussion. And the final question: which of the following most closely approximates your forecast for what the Korean Peninsula experience might be over the next 20 years? 1, unification. 2, regime collapse, i.e. international destabilization in North Korea. 3, war. Or 4, status quo. And I'll allow voting in just a second. Okay, in just a few seconds, I'll close down the poll. Great. So surprisingly, a fair number of you voted for regime collapse and international destabilization. So interesting. Yep. So some food for thought. It was good to sort of gauge the temperature of the room as we move into the panel discussion portion of this breakout session. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Patrick Cronin.
Christine, thank you very much. And we're turning our microphones on now to continue this conversation with you while you continue your lunch. I'm Patrick Cronin, and I direct the Asia program at the center. Strategic competition is the theme of this year's conference, and there's no doubt that historically the Korean Peninsula has borne more than its share of the brunt of strategic competition of major powers. But now, in the last couple of years plus, we have really seen an acceleration of North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, the last year of the Obama administration, but especially the first year of the Trump administration. And throughout 2017, as we write in our new report that was released today and is available online and outside, we then entered the last 6 months of frenzied diplomacy. So we went through blazed through all of these nuclear and missile tests in 2017, and now we're blazing through summit after summit, including the first ever U.S. North Korean Leaders Summit in Singapore. And so we want to try to make sense of where we are, where we might be going, and also how we got here. And we're really very, very fortunate to be joined by two of the top diplomats who really have thought through these issues and have worked together as well in the field. Ambassador Kathleen Stevens is the William J. Perry Fellow in the Korea program at Stanford University's Asia Pacific Research Center for the moment. She has 4 decades of experience in Korean affairs, first as a Peace Corps volunteer in rural Korea in the 1970s, very different era, and in ensuing decades as a diplomat, including as ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Seoul in 2008 to 2011, and beginning in September, I believe it is, she will be the president of the Korea Economic Institute of America here in Washington, so we're delighted she's returning back to Washington. Kathy, thank you. And then Ambassador Chun Young-woo. He is the chairman of the Korean Peninsula Future Forum, which he established 5 years ago, former National Security Advisor in the Blue House, a career diplomat as well in the South Korean Foreign Ministry, who has spent more than 33 years in public service. He holds and has held so many posts at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including Second Vice Foreign Minister, Special Representative for Korean Peninsula Peace and Security Affairs, and, very importantly, head of the ROK delegation to the Six-Party Talks in 2006, 2008, which was the last time we were sort of at this point. And Ambassador Stevens was in Seoul, and all of this was going to be leading to peace and a breakthrough, and sort of that's the beginning of our discussion. After this summit in Singapore, are we now at a breakthrough, or where are we right now in terms of your assessment, Kathy, of the U.S. DPRK relationship and the relationship with North Korea in general?
Right. Well, Patrick, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for allowing me to share the stage with my good friend, Ambassador Chen Yonglu, who, yes, I first knew when he was working on the six-party talks, then as a vice minister at the Foreign Ministry, and then as National Security Advisor. And I've relied on him over the years as my great ally within our great alliance, and he's still my friend even after WikiLeaks. So, but it's great to be here. I mean, where are we now? I guess, over the last 6 or 8 months, every time someone asks me, or I think any of us, that question about where are we now on North Korea, I had to stop my head from spinning and check what happened the last 5 minutes, because it seemed like things were volatile, to say the least. Maybe we have a moment now, and this is a great stage to kind of step back and try to think about that. I do agree with what was said this morning by Senators Warren and Graham that we, from the U.S. perspective, we have made a turn to diplomacy in a very unconventional, like I say, Trumpian way. But clearly we have turned from a path that seemed to be leading towards conflict or armed conflict, or to seeing where diplomacy will lead us. I know we're going to get more into the details, so I'll stop that I won't go into that right now. I think the next step really is, what is that diplomatic path going to look like? And for the U.S., a reminder that there are many, many players in this. And of course, we've just seen Kim Jong-un yesterday return from his third trip to Beijing, and in 2 months, after 5 or 6 years of never having gone to Beijing. So there's a lot of activity in the region. I think it's important for us to keep in mind. And the other thing I took from this morning, this is a very important moment for the U.S. in terms of its alliance relationships. And these are in sharp focus, I think, as we look at the aftermath of the Singapore summit, the decision to suspend the military exercises. But final point, where are we really now? I think right now we're at, say it maybe in a somewhat provocative way, we're at a freeze for a freeze, which is what the Chinese proposed a couple of years ago. North Korea has announced before the summit, well before the summit, that it was going to stop its testing of missiles and nuclear testing. And at the press conference after the Singapore summit, President Trump announced that he was going to stop what he termed the expensive and provocative war games, the joint military exercise between the U.S. and South Korea. So I know we'll talk more about the pros and cons of that, but I think we're at a freeze for a freeze. There's an agreement among all that it's time for diplomacy, and we've got to see where that diplomacy is going to take us.
Well, that's a great beginning indeed. In many ways, we are really at a freeze for a freeze, even if that's not what the administration intends. They certainly don't intend to stop there. And that's not the expectation, but the clock is now running. And Ambassador Chun, it seems to me one of the challenges here is you give us your assessment from your view of how the summit has left us now in terms of diplomacy with North Korea. There's a huge gap between how this is being viewed in Seoul and how it's viewed in the United States in general, and maybe you can address that gap as well.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to speak here. And well, if you look at joint statement from Singapore, you will find nothing. And there will be a lot of disappointment. But it's nothing but agreement to begin a process of negotiations. And it only lists the agenda items, that's all. But I think what is important is that it's a new beginning. It's a new beginning, and Kim Jong-un himself is directly engaged in this process. And even if Singapore summit was not a success, I think there will be many more rounds. I think whether we can achieve the goal of denuclearization or not depends not on one summit, but I think it will depend on how the expert level negotiations work out the specific agenda items. And I'm not that as much pessimistic as many American pundits. I'm considered as enemy of the Moon administration for being critical about the way the government deals with North Korean policy. But I'm not that pessimistic, because I think Kim Jong-un made some kind of strategic decision on nuclear issue. And I think all this process starts from Kim Jong-un's declaration of the completion of national nuclear force on December 12th last year, which was based on the success of hydrogen bomb test in September and ICBM, Hwasong-15 ICBM test at the end of November. So he concluded that nuclear development has achieved its intended goal now. So he now decided to shift North Korea's priority to economic development, and that's very encouraging new development. And he knows, I think he seems to know that his economic goal cannot be achieved without a deal on the nuclear front. We do not know how far he can go, but he will try to hold as much nuclear arsenal as possible for as long as possible, if he can. But he will go all the way to full denuclearization only if he has no other choice. And it depends on U.S. strategy, U.S. negotiating skills, whether that goal, the full CVID, can be achieved or not. So I wouldn't say that North Korea will never give up its nuclear arsenal. It depends on how the future negotiations proceed. And I think the reason that I'm more optimistic now is because the completion of national nuclear force means that Kim Jong-un he now knows how easy it is to rebuild the nuclear arsenal. He can do that in 1 or 2 years. And he can do that without provoking U.S. into military action because he doesn't need any more tests, no more nuclear tests, no more missile tests. So, and it is far more difficult to retain his nuclear and missile capabilities now under strengthening sanctions than to rebuild nuclear arsenal when necessary, when North Korea is maybe 10 times stronger economically than now. So with a fraction of cost that he has to pay to retain nuclear force now, he can rebuild nuclear arsenal 10 years from now, 15 years from now, if he still feels threatened by U.S. hostile policy. So I think the completion of national nuclear force is the most important basis for his strategic shift. Although sanctions and more credible military option may have played an important role, I think if he didn't complete national nuclear force or development of nuclear arsenal, I think he could have gone further. He could have waited longer. So in that regard, I think diplomacy has a chance, and it's time to make the best use of the chance offered by North Korea's strategic shift.
I think that's a great explanation. I want to get Ambassador Stevens' response to that, but also to bring in, from the U.S. diplomatic perspective, if you were trying to help Secretary Pompeo right now do the hard work and try to gain enough leverage to encourage Kim Jong-un to do more rather than less in terms of significant dismantlement, have we given away too much, as Senator Warren said this morning, or do you think there's still a lot of leverage out there for the United States in diplomacy in the next number of months, especially if the clock is ticking, say, toward the end of the year, to see something significant and visible?
Well, I mean, I think, and this is, you say, maybe this is the punditry that says it, I think it was unfortunate to announce the stoppage of the exercises, particularly without consultation. But I also think it was, at this point, perhaps unnecessary. I do agree with that critique. And I also was concerned about the floating of the idea that we might withdraw troops. So I appreciate the polling about that. And again, I think the alliance management part of this is very important, notwithstanding the fact that I think the Moon Jaein government is so committed to this that they're prepared to, if you like, forbear and cooperate as much as possible. But yes, the diplomatic path going forward is very important. And I guess here's what I would say, I guess both you and to Secretary Pompeo. First of all, I think Ambassador Chun makes a very important point about the, if you like, the agency of Kim Jong-un on this. And I too am convinced from not only what he has said, but what we are seeing in North Korean internal media, that he is, in a way that his father and grandfather were not, committed and believes in a vision of a DPRK that becomes, if you like, the 21st century Asian tiger that achieves economic development. He has a time span in mind, I imagine, as a man in his early 30s of 50 years, and he wants to achieve that. But as you say, I think the question is, he probably thinks right now that maybe he can achieve that, or at least get a long way towards that goal, while still retaining some remaining nuclear deterrent, if you like, or capability. The job of diplomacy, including the United States, will be to persuade him that that's not the case, but that we are ready. And here's where I think President Trump was right and really connected with Kim Jong-un to emphasize the economic development aspect of this, as sort of silly as some of that sort of seemed, I think, sometimes to American ears and eyes. The other element that I think is very important, I would emphasize, is the role of South Korea. And in particular of the current president, Moon Jaein, who, as I think Ambassador Chun has indicated, in a way, enjoys great support within his own country for what's going on right now. This is key. And I think the switch to, if you like, a more Korea Peninsula-focused diplomacy is one that is in U.S. interest and that works for us well. But it does mean we now must come up with a diplomatic strategy that, shall I say, is a little bit less, I mean, hub and spoke. You know, we use it sometimes to describe the U.S. and in Asia. But I mean, it also kind of looks like Kim Jong-un right now. I mean, he's seeing all these leaders. Everybody's, you know, China's very activated. There are visits to Russia. I think Moon Jae-in is in Russia now. I think the Japanese are feeling a little left out. Everyone has both important interests, important leverage, an important contribution to make this. And I'm not advocating a return to the six-party talks per se. There could be another format. But what I don't see right now in terms of our diplomatic strategy is, well, I mean, a diplomatic strategy, both in terms of process, if you like. Is it going to be, as the North Koreans have already said, the action for action, synchronized, step by step? Or is it going to be, as arms control agreements often are, nothing is agreed until all is agreed, let's have a timetable, some of the things that Secretary Pompeo said earlier, very unclear. But I think things are going to happen in the next few months, and there still is a lot to play for. And some of them, again, the declaration of the end of the war, the other sort of markers that Kim Jong-un have mentioned, the anniversary of the founding of the DPRK 70 years ago. Are we going to see Kim Jong-un in New York to mark that, or Donald Trump in Pyongyang? What's going to be the balance between, if you like, the pageantry, which on the U.S. side we've been a little heavy on, and the substance? So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. But I hope that diplomatic team is coming together. Certainly it's welcome that it's led by Secretary Pompeo, but I don't think he can become the Secretary of State for North Korea only. There's a lot else out there, and that there will be a team there that can build this, and also the North Koreans will be at the table. But working with our South Korean allies, I think one lesson we've certainly learned from the past is yes, there's been a lot of failures, but a sine qua non of making any progress is for Seoul and Washington to be lashed up. I think we've got a pretty good foundation for that, but I think we have to really work on that, but also to bring in and the participation and cooperation of the other major players in the region.
Ambassador Chun, there are a number of issues that I'd like to pick up on. One of them is your expectation for the coordination between U.S. and RK strategy here. Before getting to the summit, there was a good cop, bad cop that was often played. Now we're both good cops, both rushing to give Kim Jong-un whatever he wants, it seems. Are you worried that President Moon may have to be more restrained and back up, or is he just moving full speed ahead now? Does he see green lights everywhere and he wants to try to use now this new diplomatic space? Because that relates to a second question, which is, does Seoul expect Kim to give up some significant dismantlement step in the coming months, that is in the relatively near term? Because I think that's the expectation from the national security team here in Washington. And I heard John Bolton on Fox News earlier this week. He said, we've been given these private assurances. This is what we've been told. So if that's the operating assumption in the White House, is that the operating assumption as you think the Blue House might be thinking about it? And then finally, the question of what is the multilateral mechanism that does eventually need to be overlaid if this diplomacy takes root? Are we back to six-party talks that you headed, or is some other mechanism possible?
Well, somehow I think coordination between a progressive administration in Seoul and conservative administration in Washington is, going on so smoothly. It's a miracle.
It's a surprise.
Maybe because it's an unconventional Republican president. I don't know, but somehow I see no great difficulties in coordination, and they share basically the same goal. And I think they are competing with each other in terms of enthusiasm to talk to the North Koreans. I don't want to downplay the role of the Moon Jaein administration, President Moon Jaein himself. But I think thus far, everything has been going on according to Kim Jong-un's strategy and game plan. And I think thus far he has been the biggest winner. But we just began the game. So winning in the first round doesn't mean that he will win in the entire game, or losing in the first round between U.S. and North Korea on the U.S. side doesn't mean that U.S. will lose the game entirely. So it's better to learn the lessons in the first round and not to repeat mistakes in the future rounds. So I think in that regard, I don't want to see the Singapore summit in negative light. But we have to remember that Kim Jong-un is on the driver's seat, not Moon Jae-in or President Trump. So everything, as I said, was designed. All these diplomatic offensives have been, initiated by Kim Jong-un, and of course he may have wished to use President Moon, who is more sympathetic to North Korea than many other leaders, in getting him to broker a summit with the U.S. Because while Trump was talking about fire and fury and total destruction, I think extending a hand directly to the U.S. could be seen as a sign of weakness from North Korean perspective. So I think it was smart for Kim Jong-un to use the good offices of the ROK to get to the summit with the U.S. I think Kim Jong-un is among the best strategists of our time, and I cannot tell that he has lost any bet in playing a strategic game with China, with ROK, with the U.S. I hope he doesn't win all the time until the end. But
when did you come to that conclusion? I'd be very interested to hear.
Very early.
Oh,
yeah,
really?
Yeah,
okay.
because he has been very smart. He is not swayed by impulsive thinking or emotions or how he is going to be seen in television. That's not his goal. He is very single-minded in his pursuit of strategic goals. So that's what I want to add. But let me also talk about President Trump's promise to suspend joint military exercises. I think it may be necessary in order to, in terms of confidence building measures, it's not unprecedented. Team spirit exercises were suspended for 1 year many years ago, I think in the early 90s, in order to improve the climate for direct talks with North Korea. So this is not unprecedented. And if North Koreans are, really serious about diplomatic resolution of the nuclear issue, and while they are engaged in good faith in negotiations, I think it's not such a bad idea to suspend temporarily joint military exercise. What is the problem is the way President Trump characterized the nature of the joint exercise. He used a rationale that North Koreans usually use, and that was very shocking. But I don't think President Moon can complain to President Trump, because in Panmunjom Declaration, nobody has read very carefully, I think, even in Korea. They show the good pictures, but what Article 2 of Panmunjom Declaration says is that South and North, Kim Jong-un and President Moon agreed to a language that would characterize joint military exercises as hostile act when they agreed to terminate all hostile acts against each other. The language they used was any act that can be a cause of military tension or clash in the air, on the land, and the seas, in all space on the Korean Peninsula. And typically that falls into the category of joint military exercises are exactly, that kind of hostile act. So even though President Moon used indirect language, he agreed to characterizing joint military exercises as hostile act against North Korea. So in a way, President Trump watered down the language that President Moon used or the joint Panmunjom Declaration characterized joint military exercise. I think what is really troubling is the casual manner in which President Trump mentioned the possibility of withdrawing U.S. troops. I think this is this most powerful card to play against North Korea, and to keep until the end. And this is something that he should seriously, agonize over whether to use or not, when there is no other way to denuclearize North Korea, and when there is 100% guarantee that the use of this card will ensure CVID in North Korea. So that's the time that he can think about using this card. But if he already gave it away upfront, Kim Jong-un will take it for granted. And he already pocketed withdrawal of US troops. So he will think about other things to demand. So I don't know how he could give away the most valuable card that he can play against North Korea so cheaply, and as a kind of down payment as a confidence building measure. So,
do you want to touch on the multilateral?
Multilateral, I spent more than 2 years in the six-party talks, and actually the six-party talks process was stalled after I left six-party talks. I'm not responsible for that, but anyway.
Somebody else is responsible.
Somebody else, yeah. After me, they mishandled North Korea, or I don't know. I think North Korea. I think that actually the reason why six-party talks broke down is because North Korea was ready to abandon its plutonium program. And that was based on the confidence that they could conceal their clandestine enrichment program. And the moment they got caught cheating, then that spelled the end of the six-party talks process. Well, six-party talks process has merits and demerits. When it's a multilateral guarantee, I think it becomes more credible than a bilateral U.S.-North Korea agreement. If one party defects from the agreement, then there is no way we can do anything about that. Well, but I think in the six-party talks, when other big stakeholders undersign the agreement between U.S. and North Korea, I think it becomes more credible and is more likely to be implemented. But I think the process of reaching agreement among the six parties is going to be very unwieldy and very complicated process. Normally, what happened in the six-party talks was agreement between the U.S. and North Korea and endorsed in the six-party plenary. Or in the case of February 13th agreement, I had to work out agreement with my North Korean counterpart, Kim Gae-kwan, and we presented it for endorsement to the six-party talks. So the way it works is actually, a set of bilaterals, right. And six-party is just an umbrella under which all kinds of bilateral, trilateral discussions are held. So I think it will, for this process, I think it will be more effective to leave it to the U.S. and North Korea to come up with an agreement for the sake of effectiveness and speed. But I think at the end of the process, whether six-party talks is convened or not, I think it's better to be endorsed by the leaders of the key stakeholders on the Korean Peninsula.
So maybe we can return to Kathleen Stevens and talk about the other three big powers that are very much involved in the outside of this diplomacy, outside of the Singapore summit. Certainly Prime Minister Abe, he's even talked about wanting to fund possibly a multilateral mechanism at the United Nations, and very much interested in going to Pyongyang to maybe talk about the abductee issue and see if there's another role for Japan. China's been extraordinarily active since March in reinserting itself into the diplomacy regarding North Korea. There's now been the third summit. And of course, now President Moon is off in Moscow, and Russia's always been behind the scenes in terms of North Korea as well. I mean, so how do you see those three countries intersecting the diplomacy moving forward?
Yeah. Well, with respect to Japan, I think Japan at this point is the most uncomfortable with kind of where they are and where this process is. I had someone comment to me the other day that Prime Minister Abe was famously, I think, the first leader to meet with President-elect Trump after the election, and saw him made a trip to Washington just a few days before the Singapore summit. So I think that's something like 7 meetings. And I think there's a sense, there may be other experts here, but in Japan that he doesn't have a lot to show for it in terms of attention by President Trump to core Japanese interests, including the abductees. So I think they want to find a way into this. But absent that, right, I think Prime Minister Abe is looking for a way to visit Pyongyang himself, I would assume, or have some kind of meeting and get involved. You mentioned the speculation, which of course, the statements by President Trump, which are consistent with things he said in the past about questioning the deployment of U.S. troops in Northeast Asia, that has to be a little unsettling in Japan as well, for all the obvious reasons, and gets a little bit to the discussion we were having this morning about the perception in Northeast Asia of the U.S. reliability and President Trump in particular's attitudes about alliances and whether or not they are benefits or burdens. So I think you'll find Japan wanting to get in the game. And again, the six-party talks, I totally agree with you. It was an umbrella. And as in any negotiation, I mean, in the Balkans, we did negotiations too. And I mean, multilateral, for those of you, a lot of you have been involved in negotiations. I mean, the deals aren't made when you all sit around at a great big table and everyone speaks with 5 different interpreters. They're bilateral deals. But the umbrella is important. And I think an umbrella would help, would help Japan as well. I think China has to be feeling pretty good about where things are. I think that they, well, I mean, perhaps recognize, I guess I do, that Kim Jong-un, like his father and his grandfather, is maybe even going earlier in Korean history, is skilled and aware of the benefits for a smaller country of kind of trying to play off great powers against each other. And that Kim Jong-un's opening to the U.S. Makes China a little bit nervous. But China has obviously a lot of leverage and a lot of influence and a lot of history, and it is quite remarkable when we think about it. If we think about the history books that are going to be written, here we have Kim Jong-un, who for 5 years didn't meet a single foreign leader, didn't leave the country, didn't receive anybody within the DPRK, and now within the space of 2 months, he's been perhaps the most active leader on the planet, including 3 visits to China. So I think China, recognizes that it's in a strong position now vis-a-vis North Korea, in particular with respect to sanctions. And when it comes to, I think, the U.S. position that we're not going to relax sanctions until we get denuclearization, I think that's unrealistic. Sanctions are something are proactive. You don't just sit back and say we have sanctions. You have to proactively enforce them. And already, I think there are signs that's not happening. And I think we'll see from both China as well as South Korea, I should say, a desire to really, and Russia, a desire to exert some influence, to be involved in this process, including the economic development of the DPRK, through greater economic activity there. Russia was never, a huge player in the 6-party talks, but again, it was kind of important to have them there. And I think it continues, again, to be important to consult and stay involved. This is just kind of diplomacy 101. And yes, you can do it without declaring something 6-party talks or 5-party talks or 7-party talks. At one point, Mongolia wanted to be involved. I'm not. But if you don't do that, I think it means a lot more shuttle diplomacy by your diplomats to all the capitals, and a lot more consultation in a variety of formats, bilateral, trilateral, and so on, to try to marshal support for your negotiating position. But yes, the U.S. clearly is going to take the lead in the denuclearization exercise. At the same time, South Korea has this inter-Korean track going of reconciliation on the Korean peninsula. These are related. So we're going to have very, very close consultation rather than have kind of 2 stovepiped efforts. They cross over in things that have already been much discussed and which I think we have to pay attention to in the coming months, especially if sanctions is not something where we see action. The Panmunjom Declaration talked about declaring an end to the war. President Trump has talked about that. What does that mean?
Nothing.
Yeah. When do you do it? If it means nothing, but can we get something for it, or does it lead to something else? What does a peace treaty mean? All these things. I mean, they may mean nothing until someone decides it does. So, are there cards we can play, or at least be aware of what we're doing and have some connection with them? And I'm a little bit concerned that the way we're set up now, notwithstanding the fact, as you say, that I think President Moon, the Blue House, and the White House have stayed closely linked. That maybe there needs to be a little more strategizing about how we do things that are mutually reinforcing, and that would certainly extend to the other partners and allies in the area.
Those are great comments. And Ambassador Chen, I want to absolutely follow up on these issues, please.
Yes, well, on including Russia and Japan, I think it makes sense. Whether we go for a multilateral approach or a set of bilaterals, I think it's dangerous to exclude Russia and Japan. In the 6-party talks, Russia and Japan haven't played much of positive roles. Japan because of the abduction issue. They wanted always to bring this abduction issue to the six-party talks. And until abduction issue is resolved, they were not willing to contribute anything in terms of implementation of the six-party agreement. But we cannot deny that Japan is a major stakeholder on the Korean Peninsula. And when we, or US, North Korea, reaches a final settlement on nuclear issue, then funding the economic assistance, the bulk of funding will have to come from Japan, because Japan is willing to pay more than $10 billion for the reparations of the colonial period to North Korea, and that is put on hold because of abduction issue. So once the abduction issue is resolved, or nuclear issue is resolved, I think Japan has that money on hold. So that will be very useful in resolving, in funding the denuclearization agreement. Russia, once you are in, you can never kick them out. That's the problem.
Yes.
From my observations, Russia has played more a role of a spoiler. And if Russia is excluded, it will be more active in playing a spoiler's role. And in terms of damage control, you need Russia on board. So don't expect any positive role from Russia, but not including Russia in the process is going to do more harm than good. On the end of war declaration that President Moon was so, I think he's still so fixated on, it doesn't have anything to do with the end of war, because the war actually ended 65 years ago. So end of war has been going on for 65 years. The only thing that has to be resolved is legal end to the war. And that can be resolved only by a peace treaty. End of declaration doesn't turn de facto end of war into legal end of war. But it's nothing but an agreement. It's nothing but a declaration. Okay, we are going to conclude a peace treaty. That's what end of war declaration means in practice. But to the extent that North Korea attaches value to this empty declaration, it gives us room to use it, to replace it with other things. For instance, when North Korea demands progressive sanctions relief, which we cannot easily accept because that could lessen the pressure on North Korea to follow through on its agreement. So in that case, instead of sanctions relief or other things that give us real means to get North Korea to move forward on its commitment, we can, I think, give away. This is good. This is very good. So take it instead of sanctions relief. If we can fool North Korea into believing that end of declaration is worth paper, then I think it will be helpful. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether what North Korea wants is end of declaration, end of war declaration, or I think it's a peace treaty basically. And from the September 19 joint statement 13 years ago, peace treaty is already promised to North Korea. This is contingent upon North Korea's full denuclearization. So if North Korea is really serious about denuclearization, peace treaty will be in place by the time North Korea completes its denuclearization. So I don't really see why North Korea would attach much value to end of war declaration. But and I don't understand why President Moon is so fixated on end of world declaration. Unless he has a ground to believe in his conversations with Kim Jong-un that Kim Jong-un actually, attaches to this symbolic, empty declaration of war, the declaration of the end of war.
Senator Graham earlier this morning talked about this was the last chance for diplomacy, and this is also maybe the best chance that we've had so far. Do you agree that this is the last chance for diplomacy, and that if this doesn't work, the Trump administration should go back to where we were last summer, fall, not just with deterrence and containment, but actually ratcheting up a maximum pressure strategy that could even include military options that Senator Graham said to leave on the table? Or would you stop short of there with the military options and say, let's go back to maximum economic pressure?
Well, I think if we get back into looking at military options, we are going to find them just as unappetizing and dangerous as we have every time they've been considered over the last several decades, whether it was some months ago or at other points, as we've tried to address this question over the last several decades. What kind of, and I don't want to review all that, but, when is a bloody nose a bloody nose? When is a surgical strike a surgical strike? What are the risks of a wider war? What about our allies and their views, and so on and so forth? So certainly absent North Korea doing something very provocative as a renewed nuclear test or missile testing, I think it would be difficult to marshal support in the neighborhood or internationally for, maybe even for harder sanctions. Although perhaps that's a easier reach, but for military action. I think I understand that Senator Graham wants to underscore that the pressure remains on, and I certainly endorse that. But I guess I wouldn't phrase it as this is the last chance. Because I actually think, this is likely to be. We have to get ourselves ready again for a long process. I don't think that this can be totally resolved in terms of a complete and irreversible denuclearization in a matter of months. But I think there are very important things that can happen in a short period of time. North Korea giving us a declaration of what its missile and nuclear capability. We haven't even really we haven't talked about missiles, but a declaration on its nuclear program, some return of inspectors, and we kind of know the menu. We've been there before. Return the IAEA involvement, some safeguards. There's a lot we could do. There's a lot that North Korea could do to demonstrate its, to use a favorite Korean word in English, sincerity. To indicate its seriousness of purpose. But then I think we have to be ready to continue to recognize we are going to need to hedge, if you like, in terms of deterrence and containment for a while to come. To me, that's, if the vision is a Kim Jong-un who stays in power, and leads a DPRK that becomes a responsible member of the international community. I think this is what you were saying as well, but I certainly think that he sees this as an arms control negotiation. Our job will be to hasten the day when North Korea does not have nuclear weapons, but I think it's going to be a fairly slow process. Whether or not that's politically acceptable here or by this administration, it's another question.
Ambassador Chun, you're going to get the last word, and I hope you will address not just that question, if you will, but the expectation of when, if ever, the Moon administration would revert to maximum pressure. Is there some tipping point that they would be willing to do that, or are they just so far into this diplomacy that they couldn't countenance trying to return to pressure strategy? And then maybe more optimistically, since you run the future Korean Peninsula Forum, what is your vision for a hopeful Korean Peninsula?
Well, about the earlier question that Senator Graham mentioned, whether it's going to be last chance, I think it's I take his point. I think it may well be the last chance for diplomacy, because I think Kim Jong-un takes big personal risk. It's different from getting his deputies, ministers commit to denuclearization. He himself is committed, and if anything goes wrong in terms of being caught cheating, he cannot put blame on anybody else. So he can be held accountable for any material breach of any agreement. Some minor violations, by mistakes, this is something else, but any material breach of the agreement, the entire burden will fall on him, and he cannot run away from the consequences. So in that regard, it could well be the last option. About military option, I'm not a great fan of military option, but I think the best way to avoid military action is by making military option as credible as possible. That's the only way. But military option is best when you don't have to use it.
Yes.
And and I think even a military action is very dangerous. We have to do everything to avoid it. The only thing worse than military option is living with nuclear-armed North Korea. About the question that you raised about President Moon's return to maximum pressure, personally, I'm skeptical. I think what Kim Jong-un earned in Singapore is that he took steam out of maximum pressure and even military option. So I think that's his big achievement in Singapore. Even if he is very slow in implementation or tries to prevaricate, I don't think it's going to be easy to return to the maximum pressure, the kind of maximum pressure that pre-existed. So, and I think given the enthusiasm with which President Moon wishes to improve relations with North Korea at any cost. So I think in his thinking, his achievement is that he eliminated one big obstacle standing in the way of inter-Korean reconciliation, inter-Korean cooperation. So if something happens in the way of North Korea's denuclearization, I think President Moon and his entourage will be very reluctant to go along with to go back to the earlier period through maximum pressure.
And in a sentence, do you have a hopeful future for the peninsula?
About the future, well, if everything goes well,
Yes.
in terms of denuclearization, I think the alliance will be the biggest casualty. So it's not cost-free. So, and also the hope of unification will be gone. I think any, especially peace agreement with North Korea and withdrawal of U.S. troops, all these things will lead to perpetual division of the Korean Peninsula and eventually to two-state systems on the Korean Peninsula. So I think once a peace treaty is signed, unless North Korea is a sovereign state, this is not going to be ratified by the ROK National Assembly, because only international treaties can be ratified. This will be legally an agreement between central government and unauthorized self-governing territory under the sovereignty of the Republic of Korea. And this is not something that can be legally ratified by Congress. And but between U.S. and North Korea, it will become if it becomes a treaty. I don't know how the legal problems can be resolved, but I think what President Moon and his administration want at the end of the process is, a division, two sovereign states on the Korean Peninsula. So I don't know whether that will be helpful in unifying.
Yes.
Divorce sometimes doesn't stand in the way of remarriage. So
right.
I don't know whether divorce is a better way to remarry, or separation is going to be better. I don't know.
We will ponder that thought as we get ready to go back to the plenary session. But first, please join me in thanking Ambassadors Chun and Stephen. And the next session, unfortunately, is beginning right away. I wish we had more time. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick.